When you're serving in a church, you inevitably find yourself in situations where you need to speak in front of others. Maybe it's a prayer, announcements, or maybe you were asked to preach. Whatever it is, for most of us in church, public speaking is a necessity in some capacity. So in this video, you're going to learn my best tips on how to become a confident and comfortable speaker.
Well, hey there, and welcome to Pro Church Tools, the show to help you share the message of Jesus while we navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm your host, Alex Mills, joined as always by Brady Shearer.
On this episode, Alex, we've got 5 tips to help you be a more comfortable and confident speaker. So let's dive right in. The first, and this is the most painful,
It
which is why we're
really
leading
is.
with it,
It's so tough.
is to listen and to watch yourself speak. So there are a number of different ways that you can do this. If you, as a church, film your services or live stream, you can go back, watch the video of you preaching or doing announcements or leading a prayer. Maybe you're the worship leader in between songs. You do a bit of speaking there. Maybe you host a podcast at your church. Maybe you, as a youth leader, are just praying and, you can turn your iPhone on and listen back. There's no better teacher than watching yourself and the horror of what it's like to watch and listen to yourself. There are things that I, even after 60,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel, more than 3 million views on this YouTube channel, I'm still watching and trying to get better because there are still things that I do that I wish that I didn't. Let's talk about specifics. Because I know that if you're watching this, you're like, finally, he's going to address this.
Well, now you can keep yourself accountable.
Really, that's what this episode is for. The first is the phone touch. For some reason, I have this little, tick to just touch my phone like this. I'll be in the middle of a point and be like, and that's why social media is important. Just moving your phone 1 inch to the left, 1 inch to the right. And it's just, people in the comments have been like, dude,
hey man,
what are you doing?
Stop touching that phone.
And maybe you have comments like this that are helpful for you while hurtful. Just because they're hurtful does not necessarily mean they are not helpful.
Yes.
The other one is I do this weird flex with my hand. I've got a lot of hand movements that I'm comfortable with. This is a good one.
Yeah.
The counting on the fingers,
Sure.
very good. This, where I put my hand.
The inverted claw.
Yeah, how would you describe this to the podcast listeners?
I wouldn't, but you kind of got your hand propped on the table.
Into like a tent formation.
It looks kind of like a teepee, but it's canted. Like you kind of got it flexed a little bit. Where
it's not masculine. It's not feminine.
Yeah,
it's alien. Humans don't make this formation. And so I keep seeing myself do this. I think it's just I'm so psyched and amped up about the point.
You're like bracing yourself. Yeah.
I need to stop both of those things.
Well, and you wouldn't notice those things if you didn't watch the playback, which is painful. Like I remember before smartphones, where one of the only opportunities you ever had, I guess, as a kid to hear yourself talk was listening to your voicemail. So like you'd call your voicemail and be like, is that really what I sound like? Like hearing your voice the way other people hear it because it sounds different coming out of your own mouth, whatever.
So funny.
But I remember when I started preaching, I had to force myself to do that exercise. About a year after I started preaching, I by my dad's suggestion, I painfully went back and watched my first sermon ever, which when I preached it, I thought was flawless. Like, I nailed that. And you go back and watch it, it's like, oh, why were you talking that way? Why were you touching the pulpit that way? Why, like my dad—
You're doing the inverted hand
No,
tense?
but my dad's got a thing where he carries change in his pocket for, I don't know, like pop machines or like, what do you use change for? I don't know.
Nothing.
But he carries change in his pocket, and on Sundays, he has a habit of putting his hand in his pocket and playing with his change. And he's got no idea. And like me and my mom are like, Dad, can you stop with the change?
So
like,
you spoke to him.
Yeah, like we can hear you. But he wouldn't know that. We don't film our services, so he wouldn't be able to see it, and you can't hear it on the mic. So we have to keep him accountable to that. But I mean, I've got them too. When I preach, I always preach on the left side of the pulpit, kind of lean on the pulpit, and I play with my wedding ring all the time. And I have a habit of putting my hands in my pockets when I preach. And my Catholic grandfather, he didn't like that. He would visit our church when he was still around, and he would tell me, he says, son, you can't be a preacher with your hands in your pocket. You always got to have them free and free to point the people to the heavens.
Wow.
So you're going to get feedback from other people, whether you like it or not. But the most valuable feedback is going to be from yourself when you choose to say, hey, I'm going to listen to that last set that I sang and hear how I actually sang that. Because I know what I thought I sounded like, but I want to hear what I actually sounded like. Same goes for preaching, leading at a youth camp, whatever it is. This is just a painful thing we have to do, but it makes us better.
It's a great practice in humility
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
taking us closer to the Lord.
Yes.
Number 2, use stories as your cheat code. One thing that I struggled with when I was first getting into, speaking in front of others was I always wanted my words to be absolutely perfect. And if I said a word incorrectly, or if I used a word that perhaps would have been more articulate if I substituted it for a different word, I would kind of beat myself up. Like, oh, your vocabulary is stronger than that,
You
Braid.
just read the thesaurus at night.
Look, I love using big words, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's unnecessary. And then sometimes I'll become a bit too ambitious and use a big word incorrectly.
I feel like that's not
Congratulations,
what that word means.
you played yourself. One thing that you can do if you are new to public speaking is just use stories as a crutch, because storytelling is perhaps the only form of human communication that earns attention and keeps attention virtually automatically. You don't need to be a talented speaker. You can tell a story in an almost incoherent way, but just the fact that it's a story will get people to listen. And so if you're trying to share an announcement, if you're kicking off a sermon, if you are leading a team at your church and, it's before a Sunday or it's before some type of ministry and you're just having a team meeting, use story as much as you can, because one, the receivers of this message are going to be happy to hear it, but also you as the speaker, you don't need to rehearse it necessarily.
Right.
You don't need to memorize it. And it's a lot more loose and free for you to explore within the story. And if it's not that great of a story, hey, that's still better than almost a perfectly recited script.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling is so much more entertaining, so much better for the listener. But as the person who's delivering the message, and I consider this in the context of sermons all the time when I'm preaching, it's so much easier to preach from personal stories because I live those moments, right? I don't have to memorize them or try and recall something that somebody else said. It's like, no, I was there, so I don't have to reference my notes to recount the story. I was there, I lived it, and I don't know how it works biologically. There's probably deeper grooves in my brain or however it works, but I can recall that it's more effortless for me. And then, of course, for the audience, we all connect with stories, and so it's just so much more helpful to listen to somebody who tells stories when they're trying to communicate a message.
Tip number 3, pace and pitch. You want to vary both of these things. So when you're speaking, to avoid that monotonous tone that we've all heard in speakers, maybe you've been to a wedding, someone's giving a speech, and you just wish this person never got married because it wasn't worth listening to the speech from the dad, because dad's really happy for his daughter, his son getting married, but he's basically just being, I remember when we brought you home and it was so terrible to listen to you talk. It's not worth it. Pace and pitch. You want to speed up the way that you're speaking, but also to slow down when you really want to emphasize a point. But then also the pitch. You don't want to stay monotonous with the actual scale or with the, what's it called? Or the octave that you're speaking in. You can go low, you can go a little bit higher. When you're trying to be funny, you'll probably notice this when I talk. When I'm trying to make like kind of a frantic, funny point, I'll be like, well, that's what I'll do.
That's true.
Pace and pitch.
Now
you know the secrets.
I was just actually going to say, you want to be careful not to exaggerate this.
Well,
but then you exaggerate it. But you do want to be careful not to exaggerate this, on either side of the scale. You don't want to be too dramatic in how slow you talk.
Oh, I have a good example.
To try and emphasize the point that you're trying to bring home.
We were watching a pastor the other day on YouTube, and it was like a comedic pastor video of some pastor saying something ridiculous. But it was almost a caricature, a trope of what like maybe our tradition of charismatic Pentecostal pastors do. You know when you're like watching a movie on Netflix at home and you can never find the right volume on the TV?
Right.
Because the dynamic range of audio is so stark. So you'll have it turned up because like the quiet moments you want to hear, but then an action moment will begin and suddenly like you're waking up the entire house because it's way too loud. Pastors in the charismatic tradition are notorious for doing this.
Do they ever do this? They just can't get it together.
And that's when the Lord told me that if I wanted to truly rely on him, I'd have to say goodbye to the vices in my life.
It's like, okay.
Poor sound engineer that had to just edit that in this podcast.
Yes.
But sound engineers in church have been dealing with this for years.
Yes.
So yeah, you can over-exaggerate it in a way where it's comical. Avoid that. But don't be monotonous either.
Yes.
Find the happy medium. Number 4, smile. Smiling during communication is an amazing way to show that you're comfortable in what you're doing. And we know that public speaking is perhaps the greatest fear of all humankind. We'd rather die than have to speak in front of others.
Right.
So it's safe to assume that most people that are public speaking are nervous or not comfortable. And if you're not comfortable as the speaker, then the audience is certainly not going to be comfortable. So to put them at ease, you want to smile and show that, hey, this is no big deal. And once you're at ease, clearly, because you're smiling, they'll be at ease and everyone's a lot happier.
A lot of the sermons that I've got like the best feedback from have been ones where there's been a lot of humor involved, whether I planned it or not. And just kind of that,
point.
just that like jovial, like lighthearted, and especially in church because we're talking about like existential matters. A lot of it can like be really heavy sometimes. I'm always trying to think like, okay, where can I bring like, we're talking about some heavy stuff here at church today. Like, where can I bring some light moments to this to just remind ourselves that like it's all good. Like I'm good, you're good, we're all good.
No shame.
Yeah, and so like joy and humor, those are all just like tactics that I use to kind of elevate the mood in the room and make that like emotional connection with the people that are listening to me that don't often have the opportunity to talk back in that moment. Like a lot of times in church, it's usually like a TED Talk style, right? Like I'm talking and you are listening. And so we use smiles and we use those facial emotions to make those points of connection even when we can't talk back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. 5th and final point is to find your style. You've probably heard it said before, like you don't want to be a carbon copy of somebody else. You don't want to just like completely copy the style of someone else because that won't be true to you.
Sure.
But at the same point, if you have never done something like public speaking before, or if you're not comfortable, if you're not confident in that yet, you might be thinking, okay, how do I go about finding my voice if I can't copy someone else's voice, but I haven't even discovered what my voice is yet? So what I like to do is something called copy and combine. And I do this in pretty much every creative endeavor. And that is to study the way that someone else does something. In this instance, that's public speaking. Maybe it's graphic design, maybe it's video production. And then to learn how they do it, and then replicate that for somebody else. And I'll just take things from them that are basic carbon copies of specific things they'll do, and I'll integrate them into the way I public speak, or I design, or I video produce. And after you've done that half a dozen times, you start to notice the things that you like the most. And after a while, they're not necessarily traits that you've copied from others, they've become your own.
Yeah.
And I can give you real examples of this in my own life. I listened to Gary Vaynerchuk almost like exclusively for a good 12 to 18 months, around the 2017, 2018 period. And you can hear that reflected in the way that I would do YouTube videos. We would get YouTube videos and be like, he's like the Gary V for Jesus followers. And I would be like, hey, is that obvious,
right.
eh? Like, minus the cursing,
Yeah.
it's virtually identical because I was listening to him so much because I loved the way that he communicated, that it was through osmosis, like coming through me and then going into the videos and podcasts that I produced. But I have stopped listening to Gary Vee just because usually I cycle through people after a year or two and then bring in a new person to influence the way that I'm speaking. And, I've heard Gary Vee say it enough, like, work harder.
Yes.
Okay,
got it. Next.
I mean, time to move on.
Thank you. Next. Yeah.
But growing up, my mom loved sitcoms. So we'd be, oh my gosh, I just did it. Guys,
okay.
I did it. I did the hand. I did the double hand
It's
tent.
okay. You can watch this back and see how many times you've done it.
This is a
and
travesty.
We'll learn.
Podcast listeners, it was a giant hand tent. You got to go to YouTube.
It was
and
a
watch
double. It was a double hand.
It was
tent.
a double hand tent that was smashing on the table. Okay. Well,
Sitcoms.
try that again. We would always watch sitcoms in the home. 2 of my mom's favorites were Friends and Seinfeld. And as I was learning, and finding my voice as a teenager, I would become carbon copies of the ones that I found the funniest.
Sure.
So the comedic energy of a Chandler Bing, or the comedic timing, or dry like sarcastic humor of a Jerry Seinfeld or the over-the-top like Kramer mannerisms, I found myself like picking those up, but I would watch enough sitcoms that, you know, I'd go through a phase where I was almost like identical to Chandler,
Right.
but then I would start watching Community and I'd get a little bit of Troy Barnes or a little bit of like dry sarcasm of a Jeffrey Winger, and all of these things would combine, copy and combine, copy and combine. One of the best rappers alive right now, J. Cole, in his song Middle Child, he says, I copied your cadence, I mirrored your style, I studied the greats, I'm the greatest right now. And he's talking there about when he was getting into rap, how much he idolized the people that went before him. And he would just like copy their cadence and the tiniest little things that they would do, the tone of their voice, the pitch, the pace. And he would copy it. But now he's done that with so many greats that he's created his own style, and that's what makes him great.
Yeah.
But I love that because he's not like downplaying the fact that others went before him that he learned from. He's not saying, I'm this self-made, you know, no one's ever done it like me. He's like, no, there were so many greats, and because of you, I am now great in my own way.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with this tactic of like copying what you like from somebody else. You know, a lot of the pastors that we look up to as public speakers have such a large following because they're great at public speaking, right? Thousands of people will sit and listen to them speak every week. Why? Because they're good at speaking to thousands of people.
Right.
And so that's why we like to listen to them. You and I have a pastor friend who loves Judah Smith, loves what he preaches and how he preaches.
Jeez.
So when you listen to this friend of ours, you hear Judah Smith. Now, I have a pastor that I really love to listen to, Brian Zahn, pastor of Word of Life Church in St. Joseph, Missouri. I love him for what he teaches. I don't love how he teaches, but I know that the more I listen to him, I just know how we work as humans. I know that if I'm not conscious of it, I will start to pick up some of his delivery. So I'm actually like doing it in the inverse. I know that I don't really love how Brian delivers his sermon, so I have to actively like choose like, okay, don't say this like Brian's on right now.
Nice.
So I'm doing it in both ways, copying and then seeing things as like, oh, I actually don't want to sound like that. So when I'm delivering, when I'm saying, when I'm telling a story like this, make sure to be true to who I am and what my intrinsic voice is, right? So there's no shame, there's nothing wrong in this tactic of copying and combining to find your own voice.
So if my approach was the consume, copy, combine, yours is the consume, cower, run, and hide because you don't want in any way to.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hey, that's a great tip. These work in the inverse. 5 tips to help you be more comfortable, more confident in speaking. That'll do it for this episode of Pro Church Tools. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for watching this video for the last 10, 20 minutes. We have been giving and giving and giving, and we don't ask for much in return. We just want you to hit that subscribe button.
And just one more thing. Hit that like button.
That's all.